Alright, I am back with another video, and today is the day, the final episode of the Deity build series. This is the last of the Dead 3 builds that we are going to be doing, which will round off the series proper. And we're going to be finishing it quite strong with Myrkul. Obviously, very important deity in the game, has a very, very strong presence throughout, especially into Act 2, where he is basically the final boss of the act. He's the only one of the Dead 3 that you directly fight, which I think is quite interesting. And as such, this was a pretty important build to get right, and myself and our members of the community really did a good job with this one. At least I think we were able to come up with an interesting build that obviously plays on the kind of themes that a god of death and obviously necromancy is going to bring about, but in a slightly different way that we haven't really covered. And I don't know, I think this one is going to be extremely fun. And so I'm not really going to go on with the preamble too much here. Just know that thank you, I guess. This being the end of the Deity build series is such a huge thing. It's the longest running series on the channel, and the fact that we were actually able to make it all the way here is just absolutely incredible. I've had some amazing support from the community, and obviously this has been a massive community effort for the most part, so the fact that all of these ideas, we came up with together, I mean, it's sad that it's going to be over, but don't worry, community build streams are not going to be ending. We're going to have streams where we do, like, themed party builds. I've got an idea to do maybe a sort of MMO light party type thing, where, we build a party with a tank, a DPS, and, like, healers and such like that. It's, like, just fun themed party builds that can be like, different build series, and who knows, there may be different build series down the road as well, maybe something to do with the origin characters. I've got something planned for this month. There's a ton of different things we can do, so don't get me wrong, the kind of idea of the Deity build series, like, is finished because we're not doing Deity builds anymore, but there will be more build live streams where we as a community can work together to come up with some cool stuff, especially now that mods are a thing, because the Deity build series was entirely vanilla, but now that we have mods, we can experiment a little bit more, because some mods are available to everyone. Anyway, rant over, let's get into the build. First up, we're going to be playing as a fighter to start. We kind of did want to embody like a kind of warrior type with this build, which we know that Ketheric already was, but it does just kind of feel right in our opinion. I liked the idea of this character who has killed so many on the battlefield that eventually the blood ran so thick and the corpses started to follow them. Like the idea that of someone who's just slayed so many in combat that they just start raising the dead around them almost unconsciously seemed like a really cool idea for like a chosen of Myrkul. So going for like a kind of Gishy type character, again, a bit similar to Ketheric's Paladin, but we are doing it in a very different way, as you will see. So we're going to be starting off with a fighter, which means we get to pick a fighting style. I'm going to be going with great weapon fighting here because we are going to be two-handing a weapon with this build. We're also going to go for these ability scores. Now, these ability scores are ones that you are going to respec into, I would say, around level 6, because you're going to be mainly using a quarterstaff for this build, and we'll get into how that's going to work in a minute. But obviously, normally, quarterstaffs use strength, and of course, I've dumped strength here. So I would start off your playthrough with this build with a pretty standard fighter spread. Go for a 16 in strength. We are going to be using heavy armor, so you can keep your dexterity a bit lower. I would say constitution needs to be at a decent level. I would say let's pop that up to 16. Intelligence can be around a 14. We don't need a big spellcasting modifier just yet, but feel free to swap constitution and intelligence around, and then either wisdom or charisma at 10. But once you have gotten to around level 6, like I said, we're going to be dumping strength and instead doing our ability scores a bit more like this. A 14 in dexterity, we're not going to really need it that much. We are wearing heavy armor, but this is going to help with initiative a little bit. Constitution at 16, we definitely want to have high concentration saving throws. This mixed with fighter's con save proficiency means that we're going to be able to keep up our important concentration spells a lot easier. Intelligence is also going to be at 16. It is going to be our main spellcasting modifier, as well as eventually our main attacking modifier, and I'll get into how that's going to work a bit later. And then finally, for your last few stat points, put them into whatever you like. I like to putting 10 into wisdom and charisma, but feel free to put like a 12 in charisma or wisdom if you like. Next up, for your skill proficiencies, I have gone with the soldier background for athletics and intimidation, and I've picked insight and perception for our fighter proficiencies. For our race, we are playing as an Asmodeus Tiefling. Now you're probably wondering, hey, you've just made a strong, feminine Asmodeus Tiefling. Is this not just a Karlach build? I mean, not really, but I also thought this would be a cool idea for this character to almost be like a rival to Karlach in a way. Two people who of similar backgrounds who have seen a lot of bloodshed, but ended up going down completely different paths in life. Like, come on. It's one of those, like, shonen anime type rivalries. It's kind of cool. I mean, at least in my opinion. Especially since the things that these guys will be doing will probably mean that you're going to come to blows with Karlach anyway, which means she'll probably die very early on, so it's not much of a rivalry. But hey, you could also do an evil Karlach run with this build. Just saying, you could turn any of the origin characters into the 3 builds I've presented today, which could be very fun. Like I say, you got Dark Urge for Cabal. You've got maybe, ooh, who would be good for Bane? Astarion would be good for Bane, actually, like Ascended Astarion. And then this one's Karlach. There you go. That's how you do it. Now, next up, I'm just not even going to play coy with it. We're obviously going to be multi-classing into Necromancer Wizard at some point. So it's at this point of the build, you need to make a choice. Do you care more about getting your summoned zombies and your necromancy stuff first, or do you care more about getting your fighter stuff first? Because we're making a Wizard Eldritch Knight here. So really, you have to kind of choose what you want to prioritize first. I think it's going to feel like a more natural progression if you go with the fighter levels first, then the wizard levels after. Yes, it technically means you don't get your powerful necromancy abilities until the later game, but because of equipment and such like that, we can still summon zombies earlier on than we normally would be able to. So I would say go with the fighter levels first, just get that full martial capability and a couple of feats, then go into the wizard stuff later. But if you feel like you can survive the early levels with a level 1 fighter and then go a few levels of wizard, then by all means go ahead. You're not going to be a bad character, you are just going to feel a bit squishy for someone who is kind of supposed to be in the front lines. Anyways, for level 2 of fighter, you're going to be able to grab Action Surge. We all know what this does, it gives us an extra action. It's pretty damn good. Next up, at fighter level 3, we get to choose our subclass, and I've already said it, we're going with Eldritch Knight. Eldritch Knight is going to give us some early levels of spellcasting. Again, this feels a bit nicer if you're going with the fighter levels first. This is going to feel great to use in the early game. It's intelligence-based spellcasting, which means it's going to go nicely with Wizard, and we're going to get a few features. Namely, we're going to get access to Weapon Bond, meaning that our weapon cannot be knocked out of our hand and returns to us when thrown. We're probably not going to be throwing our weapon with this build, but being prevented from being disarmed is always a nice thing to have. We're going to get to pick up a couple of cantrips as well, and of course we're going to be grabbing Bone Chill as our damaging cantrip of choice. It is a necromancy cantrip that prevents the target from being able to be healed. This is literally Myrkul's ability. He uses Bone Chill in his boss fight, and an undead target will receive disadvantage on attack rolls. So this allows us to do a lot of things. It just allows us to do a bit of range damage, which is necrotic damage that is not often resisted, unless they are undead, which, to be honest, if we're fighting undead, we're probably going to be controlling them. A little bit more on that later. As well as being able to make it so undead targets receive disadvantage on attack rolls as well, if you really do have to fight them. This is just an all-around great thematic cantrip for us. Now, it's up to you, really, what you want your next cantrip to be. It's honestly up to you. I wouldn't recommend Friends this time. I mean, if you're running this with the other deity builds that I've made, we don't really need Friends on this one. Just pick whatever you think is going to have the most utility for you. I quite like having Shocking Grasp so that we do have a melee range cantrip just in case we need it, but any of these other utility options will be just fine. But remember, you can pick pretty much all of these up from when we take wizard levels later. Next up for our spells, I mean, these ones are going to be kind of obvious. Of course, we are grabbing Shield, which is going to allow us to, as a reaction, spend a spell slot to add a +5 to our armor class. This is going to make us extremely tanky, as well as the fact that we're going to be able to pick up Magic Missile for a reliable range damage attack that is always going to work for us. So these two spells together just work together amazingly. For our expanded wizard spell list spell, we do get these every few levels or so, and I would recommend picking up as many necromancy spells as you possibly can with these levels. For this level, I'm going to pick up Ray of Sickness as a damaging necromancy spell. It does poison damage, which obviously a lot of people don't like in this game because it's often resisted. However, just having this in our arsenal is going to make sense because it's going to synergize with some equipment and abilities that we're going to get later, as well as the fact that this can possibly poison our target, meaning they suffer disadvantage on attack rolls and ability checks, making you harder to hit. So overall, it's a pretty nice damaging spell. Might not be using it all the time, especially in these early levels. You're probably going to be wanting to focus on using your first level spell slots for shield and mainly doing ranged spell damage with your cantrips, but this is still a nice option to have regardless. Next up at Fighter level 4, we are going to pick up our first feat, as well as another spell. For your spell, choose whatever you like. I always like to pick Thunderwave on Gish characters, because if you need to get into ranged spell range, I would guess out of melee combat range, you can use Thunderwave to push your enemies away from you, and then move away without having to disengage. So it's just a little bit of damage. Otherwise, pick whatever you like. Before our first feat, now as I said, you are going to be respecking your stats midway through this build to the stats that I have shown here. So at this point, it's really a pick your favourite type deal. If you have the standard 16 strength and you just want to keep bonking things, then just take an ability score improvement and bump your strength up by 2, or if you want to do Constitution for more health, it's up to you. But because at this point I'm assuming you've respect, you are going to be bumping up your intelligence here to make both our spells and eventually our weapon attacks a bit better. Again, I'll explain what I mean when we get to level 6. Next up, at Fighter level 5, we're going to gain access to extra attack. Obviously, this turns us into a full martial fighter at this point. And I will quickly mention that because we're playing as an Asmodeus Tiefling, we are going to get Darkness at this level as well, which is really, really nice to have. Darkness is going to allow us to blind our enemies. We don't have Blind Sight on this build. We don't have things like Devil Sight or something like that, but if you want to throw the Eversight Ring on this build and just go absolutely ham, go ahead. But Darkness is just a great spell to have on this build, regardless. Next up, at Fighter level 6, we get to choose our bonus feat, and this is where things are going to get a little bit interesting. I've used this combo before, and people who are on the live stream will know about this combo already, but for those of you that don't, here's something a bit fun. We're going to go with Magic Initiate Druid. This is going to allow us to choose 2 cantrips that we can use as much as we like. I'm going to take Guidance for one of them, just to gain a plus 1d4 bonus to ability checks, which is always nice to have, as well as Shillelagh. Now, you may be thinking, why on earth would we use Shillelagh when we don't have Wisdom? Now, here's the kicker. When you pick Shillelagh with Magic Initiate Druid, it uses the spellcasting ability modifier of the class you have of the last multi-class you took. You know how in this game, like how items and scrolls would use the spellcasting modifier of the last multi-class you took? Well, for both Fighter and Wizard, it is Intelligence, and Shillelagh, when picked up with this feat, will use your spellcasting modifier for that class, aka Intelligence. This means that just for the cost of a bonus action once every 10 turns, which we can absolutely meet the requirement for that no problem, we now have a high-powered staff that is going to use our intelligence for the attack and damage rolls. That's pretty damn powerful. It says it only uses it for the attack rolls, but it does also use it for the damage rolls, which is really, really nice, meaning that the damage we're going to be getting on this build is just absolutely gargantuan. It's basically Hexblade, but for staffs. It's really cool. So this means we get to pump up our intelligence to make it so that both our spells and our weapon attacks are super, super strong. It's a fun little combo, and again, getting it around level 6 after a respec makes a lot of sense. So, you also do get to pick a spell to use once per long rest from the first level Druid spell list. I'll be honest, none of these really make a lot of sense. Again, if you're running the other builds that I've made this week, then you'll know that we get most of these utility options anyway. So I mean, I guess you could just take one of the spells that will last until your next long rest, Speak with Animals, or Long Strider, probably Speak with Animals, just in case. Now, from level 6 of Fighter, we are done with our Fighter levels. We're now going to move over to Wizard. Wizard is going to give us access to a few more cantrips. Pick whatever you like. Utility options are usually the way to go. Although I do like picking up, let's say, Poison Spray, because we've already kind of got a poison thing going, as well as Ray of Frost. Ray of Frost is nice on Spellblade type builds because it reduces your target's movement speed. So if you cast this on them and then they try to move away, they cover less distance, meaning that you're more likely to be able to run in and melee attack them some more. It basically prevents your enemy from escaping. And again, cold and necrotic damage, they kind of go hand in hand. Next up for our spells, we just get to pick a buttload of spells from the Wizard spell list that we think could be useful to us. So, I've got a few options here. Find Familiar will allow us to summon a familiar that can help us, you know, in various different ways. Specifically, I want the Crow Familiar here, because again, death and, you know, ravens and crows and all that, again, thematically go hand in hand, as well as the fact that the Crow Familiar can possibly blind targets, allowing us to attack them with advantage. So, that is quite a fun thing to grab. You do have a few other options here. I would say things like Ice Knife, the utility spells, Grease is also a good one. Again, if you're running this with the other deity builds, you probably don't need these support spells because we would have already got them from other sources. So again, it's kind of a pick your favorite type deal. Oh, but I would pick up False Life because it is a necromancy spell, so it does make sense. Next up at Wizard level 2, we do get to pick our subclass, and if we weren't going for the whole Necromancy Summon Undead thing, I would absolutely be taking Abjuration right now, or Divination, but we are going with Necromancy. Necromancy is going to give us a few abilities, like the ability to learn Necromancy spells from scrolls, which are only going to cost us, which are going to have half the cost, which means by the time we're at the end of this build, we'll have level 4 spell slots, meaning that you can have Blight on this build, a very powerful Necromancy spell that I forgot to get for my testing, but you should absolutely pick up, so make sure you get some level 4 Necromancy spell scrolls to slap onto this character. Blight makes this character much stronger, and this character was already pretty strong in my testing, but Blight would absolutely take it to the next level, because it's going to work with our ability Grim Harvest. Once per turn, if you kill a creature with a spell, you regain hit points equal to twice the spell slot level used. Great for our frontline fighter here. Thrice if it's a Necromancy spell. Undead and constructs are unaffected, so this just means that as long as we get our enemies down to low health of our melee attacks, then kill them with a spell, we're going to be able to constantly regenerate health. A bit of a life-stealing thing going on here, so absolutely would pick this one up. Next up for our spells, we do get to pick a couple of more level 1 spells here. It's entirely up to you what you want to grab here, it really doesn't matter. Yeah, for Cloud, Witch Bolt. And yeah, you have a pretty strong selection of spells at this point. At Wizard level 3, we're going to get access to level 2 spells, and you have a ton of options. What I would absolutely recommend is Blindness. This is a Necromancy spell, but allows you to blind a creature, making it so attack rolls against it have advantage, and the foe attacks with disadvantage. Blinding is going to be extremely helpful, because advantage is something we want on this build. As well as Hold Person is also going to do something similar for us, allowing us to guarantee our attacks will hit and that they will be critical hits. Again, we'll be able to dish out massive damage with this build, especially because our intelligence is so high, our spell save DC is going to be pretty damn good, so it's going to be hard for our enemies to avoid our spells. Next up at Wizard level 4, we are going to get our next feat, and you do have a couple of options here. If you want, you can max out your intelligence to give your weapon and spells a bit more damage, as well as raising your spell save DC. However, in my testing, because we are two-handing a weapon, I did go with Great Weapon Master, and it worked out pretty damn nice. The damage that you get from this is going to work from the kind of stat usage change that comes from Shillelagh, so we're going to be doing absolutely massive damage, an extra +10 with our our weapon attacks. But with using our intelligence modifier. Obviously this comes with the caveat that you take a -5 to your attack roll. However, because we have so many ways of gaining advantage through blindness and working with our summoned creatures and such like that, this means that we will be able to get off our Great Weapon Master attacks extremely consistently, which is awesome. We also do get to pick another cantrip at this level, take whatever you like. I took Acid Splash, and then 2 more level 2 spells. I would recommend either, basically, there is another Necromancy spell, Ray of Enfeeblement, which can come in handy in a few situations, but I personally wouldn't recommend it for general use. I quite like picking up Melf's Acid Arrow, as it is kind of another on-theme attack, as well as Misty Step for being able to just get around the battlefield a bit more consistently. I think this is a really useful utility spell to have, and we'll be able to use it plenty of times with the amount of spell slots that we'll have. But other useful options do include Mirror Image. Ray of Enfeeblement is there. I would say Crown of Madness also works, as well as Enlarge Reduce. So it's a pick your favourite type situation, but these two are the spells that I would definitely be recommending. At Wizard level 5, we're going to gain access to level 3 spells, and this is kind of a pick your favourite type situation as well. We definitely want Animate Dead. That is kind of non-negotiable here. And I would also say Bestow Curse is very on theme for the build. It is another Necromancy spell, but it isn't the best spell in the game, so it is a pick or choose type deal. I would say I'm going to take Bestow Curse here, but feel free to swap that out for something else if you wish. Finally, at Wizard level 6, we're going to gain access to more kind of summoning features. We now get the ability to, whenever we use Animate Dead, we can raise 2 undead at once, meaning now we're going to have a little squadron of undead following us around. We also gain better summons, meaning that creatures created with Animate Dead have additional hit points equal to our wizard level, so they're going to have about 6 extra HP, which isn't a lot, but anything helps. And your proficiency bonus is added to their damage, so they're going to be doing a lot more damage at this level. We're also going to gain access to Animate Dead as a spell as well, so we don't need to take it from our spell list. So really, I shouldn't have taken it here, so take a different spell instead. Whoops, totally forgot about that. Now, we do have access to a few spells here. I would say Vampiric Touch is a fun necromancy spell, but it is also going to regain hit points whenever we damage them, and for 10 turns you can use Vampiric Touch again without expending an additional spell slot. So we can get up close and personal because we are a frontline fighter and just keep casting this spell. Again, probably not the most powerful option, but I think it's still good regardless. If you want a very powerful concentration option that's going to work amazingly for us, then yes, we are going to take Haste. Haste is going to allow us to do more weapon attacks, as well as be able to raise our armor class, and we could even cast multiple spells per turn as well, making us a very, very deadly combatant. Obviously, the caveat being that this takes our concentration, which means a lot of our other concentration spells cannot be used, as well as the fact that if the condition ends, we become lethargic, meaning that if our concentration breaks, which shouldn't happen too much because we are running a fighter with 16 con, but we could get knocked prone by something like a Steel Watcher, so be careful. But Haste does help the build out, so I would recommend bringing it. Your final kind of spell selection is going to look something along the lines of this, I would say. I think this is a pretty good lineup. And that is the build. Overall, what you're going to be getting out of this build is a pretty fun character. You're going to be getting a frontline fighter who's not afraid to get into the thick of things, is able to use their intelligence modifier for their spells and their attacks, and is able to do big damage. You're also going to be able to summon various undead to help you out, and that is going to get better with the equipment, as I'll be showing off in a minute, and you're just going to have a really fun time just kind of messing around. You've got big damage from both your spells and your weapon attacks, you're going to feel a bit tanky, and it's just a very fun theme overall. I love playing intelligence-based characters because they just don't come up as much in this game as I would like, and I think this character does fit the bill quite nicely. I will quickly show off the shillelagh thing as well. So as you can see here, we are running a 1d8 plus 11 bludgeoning damage. That is because we are getting a negative modifier from our negative strength. However, if I now cast Shillelagh, you can see now that we are now doing 1d8 plus 16 damage, which is a bit better. It is now using our intelligence modifier for the attack and damage rolls, which is awesome. But let's get into the equipment so I can show you where this build really starts to shine. First off, our weapon, the Staff of Cherished Necromancy. Creatures have disadvantage on saving throws against your necromancy spells. Amazing. When the wielder kills a hostile creature with a spell, they greedily absorb its energy and gain life essence until their next long rest. Life essence means that you can cast necromancy spells without consuming spell slots. So now, even with our limited spell slots compared to a full caster, with half of our levels being an Eldritch Knight, we now have access to way more necromancy spells than we otherwise would normally. So we're able to just spam Blight and other stuff without a care in the world. This is awesome. This also comes in with a 1d4 necrotic damage built in, so our attacks are going to do extra necrotic damage, which is always nice. I will point out the caveat here, though, that whenever you kill an enemy with necrotic damage, they do disintegrate, meaning that their corpse can't be raised. So you might want to use a spell that doesn't do necrotic damage, something like Magic Missile, or let one of your allies take out an enemy if you plan to raise them as your animate dead. But the Staff of Cherished Necromancy is going to be great for this build as a main weapon. It's always fun to use staffs on a martial build, at least in my opinion. But, of course, this is a late game weapon. For the early game, use Creation's Echo. Creation's Echo is going to basically, whenever you deal acid, fire, lightning, radiant, or necrotic damage, you become resistant to that damage type for 2 turns. So this lets you build up some resistances as you fight, and this is one of the only ways to get consistent necrotic damage in the game, necrotic damage resistance, I should say, in the game. So overall, it's actually a really fun extra little thing to have. But obviously, feel free to swap this out for anything else. In fact, if you're using a more standard fighter spread, you may just be using a greatsword or a hammer or something else. Use any weapon you like up until the Staff of Cherished Necromancy is basically what I'm saying. You're a fighter. Use whatever you want. Whatever we have in our range slot doesn't really matter, so I've just thrown the Dead Shot in there, which is going to reduce the number needed to roll a critical hit by 1. This effect can stack. So, I mean, and the wielder doubles their proficiency bonus from rolling ranged attacks with this weapon unless they have disadvantage. So even with our lower dexterity, you're still more likely than not to be able to get off attacks with the Dead Shot if you need to, but it's mainly here just to give us a higher chance to crit, because there was nothing else really to fit in this slot, since I was trying not to repeat equipment with the other Dead 3 Deity builds, because like I say, I expect those to be run together. Next up, for our headpiece, we have the Circle of Bones. This is going to give us an extra casting of Animate Dead once per long rest that isn't going to use one of our spell slots. Really, really nice for the mid-game where, again, we haven't really hit those wizard levels yet. It also means that allied undead within 6 meters are resistant to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage. The one thing I will say is that if you cast Animate Dead with this, and then try to cast Animate Dead from your regular spell list, you will lose the Animate Dead from this. You can't have 2 instances of Animate Dead up at the same time, even if they come from different sources. But this will work with other summoned sources like Connor, if you have Connor's staff, and other things that allow you to summon undead like the Necromancer Fae. Make sure you pick up any of those kind of extra things along through your playthrough as you can, because again, more undead is better. Next up for our armor, of course, we're going to use Reaper's Embrace. It is literally Myrkul's armor. I tried to avoid it because I thought, that's too easy, but at the end of the day, it just makes too much sense. And when you kind of picture it in the thing of like this Chosen takes Kefric's armor as a trophy after usurping him as Myrkul's Chosen in the story, that's kind of cool. I've also colored it with the Talos dye from the Farunian Colors mod, which kind of accents the gold a bit more, as you can see here, and makes the kind of silver a little bit shinier. It looks really cool in my opinion. You still get like the little tints of necrotic green just kind of spilling out in some of the details, and the cloth is a bit more black as well. It just accentuates all the colors a bit more and just makes it look different than normal, but without taking away the identity of the armor, which I absolutely love. So yeah, definitely want the Reaper's Embrace by beating Kefric. It's going to reduce all incoming damage done by 2, and you have a passive that you can toggle on and off called Reaper's Rigidity. When activated, you cannot be moved against your will by any spell or action, but you have disadvantage on dex saves. So you basically have to toggle this on and off. If you're up against a wizard who's spamming Fireball, then you're probably going to want to toggle it off so you don't have disadvantage on those dex saves. However, in other cases, you probably want this on so that you're not forcibly moved. You also get a unique cantrip called Howl of the Dead, allowing you to let out a bone-chilling howl that can numb nearby creatures, which halves their movement speed, and the spellcaster will have advantage on attack rolls against the affected entity. Again, another way of helping with Great Weapon Master. But of course, this is a slightly end-game armor. It will come up at the very end of Act 2. So for an earlier option, kind of around the mid-game, you can grab the plate armor, which is called the protective plate in the full game. For some reason, the mod that I use to add armor to my inventory uses the early access names. But basically, this is called the protective plate. It can be found in Act 2 pretty much right away, and it gives you resistance to necrotic damage all the time. So that is a pretty solid thing to have, and it still looks kind of cool. But I would definitely swap to Reaper's Rigidity Reaper's Embrace, I should say, when you get it. But in reality, any medium or heavy armor you find throughout the game will work just fine. Next up for our gloves, I'm assuming that if you're playing with this character, you are doing an evil run, meaning that we can kill the Night Song in order to get the upgraded Dark Justicia kit, meaning that we can pick up the Dark Justicia gauntlets, allowing all of our weapon attacks to deal an extra 1d4 necrotic damage, gives us a +1 to strength saves, as well as gives us a unique necromancy spell, Beckoning Darkness. If the creature is either lightly or heavily obscured, I should say, you can deal a big dollop of necrotic damage to them, and they will continue to take that damage every turn as long as they stay in the darkness. This works with our necromancy features from Wizard, which is nice because it is a necromancy spell. It's a nice extra thematic feature, but we mainly want it for the extra necrotic damage on our attacks, meaning that now our attacks deal 2d4 necrotic damage with the Staff of Cherished Necromancy, which is awesome. But of course there are other glove options. In the early game you can go for the Abyss Beckoners, which allows the wearer's summoned creatures to have resistance to all damage except Psychic. At the start of the summoned creature's turn, it must succeed a Wisdom save or be driven mad. Now, yes, that does mean that our summons can potentially turn on us. However, the Ghoul summons are actually they're like immune to the madness condition, so they basically just get resistance to all damage for free. So feel free to keep that in mind if you want to use these gloves in the early game. But there's also another late game option called the Blackguard's Gauntlets, which will give you a +1 to your attack rolls, a +1 to strength saving throws, as well as the ability to cast Inflict Wounds as a level 4 necromancy spell once per long rest, dealing 6d10 necrotic damage for a big burst damage attack. So that's also an option for later on. Next up for our boots, I've just gone with the Disintegrating Nightwalkers. We all kind of agreed that these are just a good fit for this build, meaning that we cannot be enwebbed, entangled, or ensnared, and cannot slip on grease or ice, so if you are using the grease spell with this build, you can kind of use it however you like, but just getting that usage of Misty Step as a bonus action once per short rest, that isn't going to take up a spell slot, it's just too useful not to have. However, an interesting side grade, I would say, for Act 3 is the Space Shunt Boots, which will give you access to Dimension Door once per long rest, because you can teleport yourself and one of your powerful undead allies together to be able to move in and attack as a duo. It's just kind of a fun little interaction that works with this build, but honestly, you don't need these ones. I just thought I might bring them up. Next up for our accessories, we have the Periaptive Wound Closure. Whenever you're downed, you automatically stabilize at the start of the turn, and whenever you are healed, you restore the maximum number of possible hit points. This basically is just going to be a kind of thematic option for allowing us to stave off death, obviously automatically succeeding all of our death saving throws, as well as being able to heal the maximum amount at all times. This does work with Second Wind, by the way, so we would always be healing 16 HP off a Second Wind, which is actually really nice. So yeah, it's just a fun thematic option that works for this build. Next up, I kind of have 4 rings here. These 2 would kind of be earlier game options that are also quite thematic if you want to use them, but these are the ones I would go for at the end. First up, the Crypt Lord Ring, of course. The Crypt Lord Ring is going to allow us to cast Create Undead, giving us a powerful undead mummy to fight at our side. Of course we're going to use this one. We also gain After Death Do Us Part, meaning that when the wearer is downed, they rise once more with half their hit points restored, but are gripped by Shadow Possession. Normally, Shadow Possession would drive you mad and make your weapon attacks deal an extra 1d4 necrotic damage. Of course, being mad makes you attack anyone who's close to you, but unfortunately, this ring is still bugged. This Shadow Possession thing does not happen. You just get up with half your hit points. In our case, we get a solid 50. So basically it just means we die and then just get up again because we're Myrkul's Chosen. We're not allowed to die. So yeah, it's just a fun thematic ring. But if you want some other options, the Whispering Promise, obviously, this works with our self-healing, allowing us to basically gain Bless whenever we get healed. Pretty self-explanatory, as well as the Ring of Exalted Marrow. This gives you 2 unique abilities. Number 1 is Extort the Risen, allowing you to basically cast a command spell on undead creatures, which normally aren't affected by it once per long rest. So this is a pretty cool little feature, as well as Ghoulish Touch, allowing you to use a kind of necromancy spell again, which does 2d6 necrotic damage and can possibly paralyze the target. Again, the fact that these are once per long rest does kind of suck, but they are very thematic abilities, so I would recommend picking it up in case you find some usage for it. And that is it. That is the build. And like I say, remember the big things you kind of have to remember with this build is you definitely want those level 4 spell scrolls, and you definitely want to abuse the equipment that comes with things like the Staff of Cherished Necromancy's kind of like life essence ability and stuff like that, in order to really make this build shine. Otherwise, you've got a great damage dealer who can fill the battlefield with summons. Again, combining this with the ball build, you'll have a lot of summons on the field, meaning you can absolutely swarm your enemies, which is amazing. And yeah, I mean, overall, it's just a solid tank, a solid damage dealer, a solid spellcaster. It doesn't do everything amazingly, it just does everything pretty well. It doesn't do any one thing better than like something else, it just does a lot of things well. And I think that's fine for a build like this. It's not the most powerful thing I've ever made. I would say compared to the Bane and the Bull builds from earlier, this build is probably the weakest of the trio, but I would still say it is still a cut above most average builds. I think it does still do, obviously it does a lot of damage, it's a great weapon master build, but again, the fact that you have so much utility with the various spells, necrotic damage is a very, very good thing to have. You have ways to gain advantage on your attack rolls for Great Weapon Master, you can paralyze people with Hold Person. There's a lot of stuff that just works here. And I do think it creates quite a cool build overall. I tested it in a few different encounters. The one you'll be seeing is the one with the Steel Watchers. Now, the Steel Watchers make this build look a lot weaker than it actually is, because basically the Steel Watchers do counter everything this build does. They cannot be blinded. They are resistant to physical damage. Like, there's a lot of things that these guys just kind of do passively that kind of shuts down this build, but against humanoid enemies and anything that isn't a Steel Watcher, this build will absolutely shred. And again, I test these things solo. This build is designed to work with the other Dead 3 builds that I've made, which means that if you put all 3 of the Dead 3 together, they are going to be absolutely unstoppable. And yeah, I mean, I guess that's it for the Deity build series. I mean, I don't think I've forgotten anything, have I? No, surely not. Wait. You guys hear that?